think if they're using that link, they are with us right now. But I know you are still looking at the YouTube one.
Yeah, I'm not seeing us on the YouTube one, so hey, I'm going to go. Mike says we can go. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Business Book Club. We apologize for the challenges that we are experiencing and that we're not able to present with you the top quality that we're used to, especially in our live events. But this COVID challenge has brought about some challenges to us. It's given us the opportunity to deal with crises, and thank goodness we're going to talk about a crisis tonight. So hopefully the Business Book Club can learn about one of the 10 or all of the 10 rules that we'll chat to our esteemed authors tonight. But ladies and gentlemen, just a few comments about the Business Book Club. I mean, why on earth does the Business Book Club exist? Well, the reason for existence is a few. One of it is it's been a childhood passion of mine. I've been extremely fortunate. I've had a mom that has taken me to libraries since the age of like 5, 6, you know, where you still had the library cards, and I had that privilege of reading and being in the habit to read. And what I've realized through reading, not just as a young child and the privilege that stories gives you, I've also learned that through reading you obtain knowledge. And when one has knowledge, you have the opportunity to think differently. And that is key and critical, because once you can think differently, there's a window of choice. And that window of choice can propel a life in a different direction. And I've seen it many a times, where when you read, you're literally obtaining somebody else's thoughts. And through that process, the benchmark or the norm has an opportunity to be shifted. And when a benchmark or a norm, which in essence is your belief, it's the stuff that goes into your heart and what you fundamentally act upon every day as your beliefs, that gets challenged through knowledge. And when you have got the guts to accept and embrace that knowledge, you've got the opportunity to change your life. Now, you know, those of us who have had schooling, those of us who had the privilege of going to universities and maybe having postgraduate degrees, for us, that's normal. You know, if we wanted to obtain knowledge, what we do is we go into, well, in the olden days, into exclusive books, and we'll go and buy a book. I don't know what we're going to do in these new days. Well, I've become accustomed to Amazon, which is actually, it works. But we can easily do that. We can easily obtain the knowledge, or easier than most people. And through the Business Book Club, we share knowledge. And as part of paying it forward, we collect books. Obviously, the COVID has given a different challenge for us in the collection of books, but the reality is we still do. I've had an email 2 days ago. Somebody is moving house. She asked, can she donate books to us? And obviously, we're saying yes. And we're taking those books, and we've since our inception in April 2017, we've collected almost 7,000 books. Now, those are 7,000 items with pages to change lives, not of 7,000 people, because our books are going into libraries. So when it goes into libraries, it has the opportunity to exponentially change people's lives. Because I recently, in the beginning of the year, I went to a library in Diepsloot. And it was amazing to see how hungry these kids are, but how dilapidated their library is. And that's the link that we bridge with the Business Book Club. That's why we exist. We interview these authors. We share the love of knowledge. And through that, we pay it forward. And we receive books as donations. And if you don't have a book to donate, we've also got a funding mechanism where we receive cash. And with that cash or funds, we then purchase books, which we then distribute to libraries. We're a Section 18A company, non-profit. So we've got all the accreditation or the tax clearance certificates or whatever is needed. And that's our reason for existence. So tonight, we continue our reason for existence. And I have the absolute pleasure and privilege to interview and have a conversation with two very, very well-known, esteemed individuals. The one is the Dean of the Gordon Institute of Business Science, Professor Nicola Kleyn. Nicola, welcome to the Business Book Club and welcome to our online event.
Thank you, Jacques. It's lovely to be here. And as somebody who actually would credit, I think, everything, so much that I've done to books, it's deeply meaningful. They've been my passion in my life since I was a very little girl. So it's special to be here.
Excellent. Well, welcome. Welcome to the Business Book Club. And then we also have Frances Hurd. She's on the other side tonight. She's usually the one doing the interviews. She's done many, many interviews. I mean, she's interviewed the likes of President Ramaphosa, Bill Gates. So she knows what it is to ask tough questions, but tonight she can relax. I've told her I'm not going to make it hard on her. It's not a question of, the wheel turns. That's not what's going to happen tonight. Tonight, we're just going to have a conversation. And I'd like to invite everyone that is busy watching this to post your questions. This is not just a conversation between me and the two authors. This is also a conversation where you are involved. And we'd love to see your questions. We'd love to see what you have to ask and how relevant is their book for this time. And Nicola and Frances, I mean, you could almost say you guys planned this. It sounds like, or it seems like you have connections in very, very high places that you've planned this. But I really enjoyed your last chapter, which actually addresses the COVID crisis specifically. But we'll leave that for last, and let's start with the beginning. So Frances, let's ask you first. Where did the inspiration for this book come from? So I know that you've attended one of the Gibbs classes, or you were a student at Gibbs. And you've obviously been in the media many a times, but where did the seed start to germinate to share the story about crises?
Well, thanks, Jacques. So it began actually with interviews that I've done over the years. And obviously, because I focus on sort of business journalism, I speak to business leaders. And sometimes I speak to them in the midst of a crisis. And years ago, I started to have this sense that business leaders with all these credentials who seem to be handling their businesses very well, once a crisis struck, things changed and they started ducking and diving, not able to answer very simple questions. And I just got the sense that many businesses were handling crises so badly. I did start to think, however, that crises are often complex, and it's easy for me to ask the questions and say, well, you're doing this all wrong. But I often wondered, how do you actually do it right? So when I did my MBA, Nicola was a supervisor on my thesis, and I took the opportunity to look at some of the academics around crisis management. And a lot of it just confirms your sort of gut knowledge. If you are wrong, apologize, tell the truth, things like that. But things that businesses across the board, multinationals, we looked at schools, we looked at some of those involved in state capture. They're not doing the right stuff that the researchers know should be done, that we know there's a different outcome. So I even used the opportunity in the intro to look at Ford when their cars were blowing up. And the CEO admitted it took more than a year to even meet the family of somebody who had died in a Ford vehicle. There was a big dispute about who was to blame. But he said he was listening to the lawyers. They said, okay, eventually it was time for him to meet the family. How do you outsource that sort of decision to a lawyer. So really, the seed, in a nutshell, was crises being mishandled across the board, and this I'm passionate about because we need to get it right. Some companies can be gutted. We look at KPMG, the fallout from a crisis that affects people who work there. This is about jobs and about our country as well.
And leaders aren't just getting it right. So for you, it was really to get this message across, so that people can have a better understanding of what crisis means and what they can do with it. So Nicola, let's hit your side of the coin. What made you decide to jump on the pages with Francis and to add your pen and your words into a book and add your stories? I mean, aren't you too busy to write a book?
Francis is very persistent, Chuck.
I knew you should say that.
So, I mean, generally as academics, we spend our lives in peer-reviewed journals, and occasionally we venture into what we call applied research. But Gibbs has always said it's a school that's close to business. And we really want to forge this connection between academia on one hand and business on the other hand. And my area of expertise is more around corporate reputation and corporate branding. I'm not a deep expert in corporate communications, but Francis's research was so interesting. I started getting more involved in the area. And when she came and said, I want to write a book, I said, you really don't need me. But, you know, I think for both of us, it's been a wonderful journey to work together. I think so often when we work on our own, and for Francis and I, we're both in very different careers, but when Francis shows up behind that camera, when I stand up in front of a class, you're on your own. And this was a lovely chance to work together and to co-create and to test and to bounce ideas around. And I think from a perspective of Francis, she's had this experience of being behind the mic, watching and engaging with journalists, and also being exposed to the academic literature. From my side, it's this deep passion with how do organizations build strong brands and reputations. And then, of course, running Gibbs, which is not a significantly large organization. But I think you as a leader, you need to put your money where your mouth is. So it's not a purely academic book. And we really came together to try and make sure that it was both well-grounded in theory. As an academic, I certainly couldn't let that pass. And Francis had had too much exposure to the theory to let it pass. But at the same time, to make sure that it was grounded in practice. And I think one of the deep frustrations that I had was just watching organizations over the last 2 years get it more and more and more wrong. So what we do know, and this is pre-COVID, is that crises are not going away. Business volatility is ever present. Social media is there. It's not a question of maybe one day when you face a crisis. Organizations are going to face crises more and more and more. And I think COVID-19 is testimony to that.
A big example of that.
Yeah, so this importance of saying, we think that there's an opportunity to reflect. We can't say that we know everything, but it gave us a chance to step back. And particularly, I think what was really galling for both of us was watching what was playing out in state capture, and how organizations that should have been coming clean, engaging with their publics and doing the right thing were constantly hiding behind masks. And so some of it was driven by a somewhat, a zealous sort of desire to actually shine a bit of a spotlight on this and say some of this stuff is not okay.
Yeah, and what they've done. So is this book for CEOs of multinationals that need to get their act together? Is this who this book is for? I mean, who did you write it for?
This book is for anybody that has a brand. That's you and me and Francis, Jacques. That's anybody who is building their own personal identity and goes through a crisis right through. And it's certainly not purely about multinationals, although I do think there are issues, and we can talk about that later, around multinationals sometimes ignoring what is happening on the periphery. South Africa is not a big market for most multinationals, but companies like Ford, KPMG ignore what is playing out on the periphery at their peril. I'll ask Francis to come in here, but one of the things we feel is very important is when you start looking at who's responsible for corporate reputation in an organization. It is first and foremost the CEO, but then it's any prescribed officer in that organization. And in an online world, any of us in whatever capacity, can actually cause a reputational breach in our organization. So to cut a long story short, from my side, it's a broad church that we're preaching to. Let me hand over to Frances and she can give a view.
So just to agree with that, I mean, we do look at some research, Jacques, that says, especially if the fundamental brand is being threatened by a crisis, then yes, in a corporate, your CEO should be the one who's the spokesperson. A lot of reputation is attributed naturally to CEOs for the crisis in the first place. So they're the ones who should be standing up. But it's not only corporates. We look at a school, like Nicola says, this applies across the board. We look at an individual. Remember the judge who drove his car into a wall,
yes,
and huge reputational damage that resulted. We look at a school principal who handled an interview on 702, in our view, pretty appallingly. And this relates to NGOs, any sort of leader or anyone who can land up on the front pages. And if you look at the world that we live in, that is almost anyone at the moment.
But what I'm also hearing, to pull it back to our audience, is that the fact of the matter is those are only the stories we hear of because they are in the media and they're big and they have a massive impact on a lot of people's lives. But the reality is these 10 rules that you very that's very well defined is actually applicable to anyone. I mean, whether you're running a business book club, a NGO, or whether you're just a head of a sales team, or whether you're running a medium-sized enterprise. I mean, these rules do apply. The fact that we're using the corporates as an example doesn't mean it's exclusively just to them. Am I right?
So if I can pick up on that, thanks, Jacques, because that is the whole point. We try to come up with rules that are applicable across organizations, across situations, and I hope that we've done that. But yes, it applies again and again and again, and hopefully they're very simple. One of the things, interestingly enough, that we excluded originally was huge sort of natural disasters or health crises. So we started writing this book before COVID arrived. We had no idea that it was coming. And that's very specific, obviously. I mean, we look at COVID, the testing, the sort of planning around how you deal with something like that is quite specific. And it was fascinating to me at the end when we wrote the postscript on COVID-19. Of course, there's still communication around how you do things. Look at the way the lockdowns are being communicated right now. There's still leadership issues, the way you make decisions, the way you justify those decisions. So it was great for me that we could then look at COVID-19 through the prism of these 10 rules. Excellent.
So Frances, while writing this book, what was the most craziest story that you think is in the book? Like, what corporate do you think really got something extremely difficult wrong, or extremely easy wrong?
Sure, this is a hard question. I would say the situation around St. John's, and to be honest, I've heard a lot of good things about the former principal, but we looked at his interview on 702. So what had happened is a teacher at St. John's had been accused of being racist in classrooms. St. John's then came out and said he would be back in the classroom. They had taken action, they care about the students, but he would be back in the classroom. And the principal was trying to justify this decision, which was very hard to justify. And he just couldn't. He could barely speak. He could barely talk about what had happened in that classroom, which just sort of opened up a whole lot of issues about him saying we care about students. So I think he handled it so badly. And one of the things we look at is the problem of leaders. And we don't know what was happening behind the scenes. We look at the public information and we only speculate about what was happening behind the scenes. But leaders can become very insulated. If you're a school principal, parents try and get their kids into your school and they appeal to you and they are a bit deferential to you. The students certainly are, and so are your staff, and you can land up sort of being out of touch. And it seemed like this principal had no idea of the kind of questioning he would face. He had actually called into the radio and then had a mouthful of teeth and couldn't answer very basic questions. So I look back and it's just startling to me, but that's what happens when leaders don't expose themselves to that sort of questioning. It's a good idea, by the way, as a corporate leader, to always take journalists' questions. I think try and get as much practice as you can being questioned, or just have an open door policy and let your people below you question the decisions you make. So you don't think that you can just talk and everybody will accept what you say, because that's not what happens when you're in a crisis and you're in the media as well.
Absolutely. And so Nicola, I want to ask the next one to you, because it stems from this conversation with Francis, because I was thinking about it while I read the book, and you know, the human psyche works from a fight or flight scenario. And when a crisis strikes, you're basically going into that space of fight or flight, where you're not rational, where your thought processes are not what they would have been in a normal event. So how do we look at it from a leadership perspective to say, you know, are we too harsh on these leaders? To say, well, you know, it's a crisis, like give them half a break, you know, or are we saying, no, it's you need to practice for this stuff. You need to do, you know, there needs to be policies and processes in place for stuff that doesn't exist. I mean, what's your take on that?
Sorry, I was muted there.
Oh, Nicola, you're still muted. We'd love to hear you. Excellent. Oh no, it's going automatically back onto to mute. You see
right.
my mute?
I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good.
Thanks.
I think what's happening is we've got me unmuting and a producer muting me, so that may be what's happening. So I'll manage my muting. But thanks, Mike, for that. So when it comes to leaders, I think we do hold leaders to higher positions of account. And there's an interesting question in the chat that says, is it fair to compare school principals with multinational business leaders? I would argue that the impact of a school principal may be less than a multinational business leader. But we expect of leaders a certain standard of behavior. We expect them to do certain things. One of the things that struck me as you were speaking to Francis is I think there are two things, and your point, Jacques, about fight or flight is interesting. I think there are two gaps, and I'm probably oversimplifying, but the one gap, and it's a gap that in this book we felt we couldn't do very much about, is where you have a leader who has fundamentally been unethical, or a leader who has done something wrong, or a leader who has created harm. And what we do try and encourage is that you have to minimize harm. You know, Francis chose the St. John's example. My case would have been the Tiger Brands example, where you know you are causing harm. And I think we've seen multiple examples of this in COVID-19. So there's one gap here that really is a call to ethics. It's a call to integrity. It's a call to honesty. If we look at the St. John's example that we look at, I think part of that was a question also of skill. It's a question of how you think about engaging with media, how you think about engaging with your publics. And part of what Francis has spoken about is that sometimes when we're not used to that, when we're not used to being put on the spot, it becomes quite difficult and quite tricky to try and explain to people what is going on, not necessarily to defend, So I think part of what we have to do is work with leaders to ensure that they can actually, to your point about the stress there, reduce the fight or flight. We emphasize, and Francis will speak about what it is as a journalist to try and engage with leaders who just won't engage with you, or who are only there to engage with you in the good times. Flight is not a good idea. But by the same token, fight can be very dangerous, because you have to actually get over that original kind of, I want to defend everything, and start trying to see something from the public's perspective. I think when we start seeing organizations and leaders being authentic and being open, public does not expect them to have all the answers. What they do expect, though, is that they're going to stand up and try and share what they possibly can. And we acknowledge in the text that there are going to be times when you can't give an answer about something specific, but at least then explain why you can't give the answer about something specific. So this question of overriding the natural instincts to run away or to fight is a fundamental skill that I think has to be thought about. And to Francis's point, has to be practiced. Of course, none of us can be ready for the crises, but I think we can go a little further in terms of, number one, building really strong relationships with stakeholders wherever possible. And we speak in the book about this reservoir of stakeholder goodwill. It's hard when you're a good company. Francis found some really interesting research comparing brands like Woolworths and Eskom and showing that when companies that are actually pretty well regarded, they can get it wrong, and we speak about Woolies in the book, sometimes are held to a higher standard of account because they are better companies. And so we see that in the past, certainly with Woolworths and Eskom. But you have to be there. As a leader, you are, I'm not even going to say paid the big bucks, but you take the obligation on your shoulders when you're a leader to stand up and engage with those publics and answer their questions.
Can I come in there, Jacques? Because just on the flight or fight, that's exactly why we wrote this book, because it's scary times when crisis hits, and even accomplished leaders who haven't been through a series of crises don't have the skills to deal with that. And we do think that in that moment, when you have lawyers telling you that you should keep quiet because anything you say can and will be used against you, or when you have reportedly in the listeriosis case involving Tiger Brands, the insurance company saying, if you admit fault, we're not going to pay out, by the way. So you're putting your company in a very precarious situation. We think they put their company in a more precarious situation by listening to that sort of advice. But you've got lawyers, you've got insurance companies, you've got a lot of loud voices, and then you may have your PR team saying, no, let's be open and honest. Let's tell the public what actually happened, because they deserve that. They're our customers or our stakeholders. It's going to be very difficult to make decisions if you don't think about these sort of things beforehand. So that is what the book is for, to prepare you and help you think, what kind of a leader am I going to be when stuff gets really hairy? And for example, we look at Tiger Brands in contrast to Maple Leaf Foods, which was this incredible company in Canada, involved in a listeriosis crisis. And the leader stood up and said, I apologize, we make this right. We settled the class action, so there was no uncertainty. And he also said, just in finality, that there are two people I don't listen to, the lawyers and the accountants. That's not how he made decisions, looking at the bottom line or the legal implications, but rather what was the right thing to do. And it actually was cost beneficial for them in the end, and created a huge amount of goodwill. It was incredible.
And that goodwill only plays out on the share price over the long run, unfortunately. But I mean, that's the conclusion that I also came to, is that your 10 rules is actually not 10 rules, because you can't teach it to somebody. Leaders can't prepare themselves for a crisis. I mean, nobody foresaw this COVID thing, but it's actually principles. It's a principle based, where you've got to go and dive into your principles. And the one principle that really stood out for me was your principle number 6, is to be human. That's really to go and to say, but what would you want to have heard if you were on the other side of this? So if you take the Tiger brands, if you had bologna in your fridge, and not the comment that the HR person necessarily made, which was despicable, but rather to say, shit, if I had bologna, my kids, am I going to take that chance? Like, I'm going to be human. I'm not going to do that. And that to me is the essence. These are principles that we actually have to deeply think about to enable us to deal with difficult situations. Because as you said, I mean, these situations are going to happen more and more, and we're going to find them more and more into our lives.
I think, Jacques, one of the things that is really important is this characteristic of empathy. And again, back to your fight thing, it's very hard when everything's leveled at you to necessarily show empathy. But ultimately, when we say be human, there are some pretty lousy human beings out there. So, we had this discussion. Do you say human? Because we'd like to kind of show up the good piece of being human. But at the end of the day, to me, I'm not suggesting that it's all about sort of bleeding hearts, but I am saying that there's an element here when you're in crisis of being honest and being empathetic. And it's particularly prevalent now. If we think about COVID-19, there are so many organizations that are bleeding and trying to shield people from something that is inevitable. If you are going to be making layoffs, if you are going to be doing things that are having a negative impact for stakeholders, part of it is actually being open about this is hard and this is difficult and this is what we're facing, but you cannot run away or bluster your way through a crisis.
No, absolutely. And Nicola, I mean, you've had some personal experience with that whole thing with empathy. And I loved your story in the book where you share your own experiences, dealing with COVID in your own Gibbs environment. And that's when it must have been quite interesting for you to have written this book about these 10 rules and then actually have to live them out directly after before you go and publish this book.
It was a bit surreal, and I think the difference, certainly in the initial stages with COVID-19, is this is not a crisis for any of us of our own making. So it wasn't a fundamental crisis that arose from the organization, and certainly in terms of the journey that the country and the world has gone on since we had our first COVID-19 case, it really is old news. But this question of having an employee who was diagnosed with COVID and having these principles from the book being top of mind and thinking, okay, well, how do we do this? Because in this question of how do you manage harm and how do you engage honestly and how do you engage quickly, really started, some of these rules started coming up very quickly. So I said to Francis, it was good practice writing the book, and it was a very interesting test. So, it wasn't an ethical crisis from our side, but it was a good test and it was useful.
And you also found that, I mean, you become different in a crisis. I mean, you as a leader, you are not the normal leader on a Monday morning that you would usually be without COVID being in the air.
I guess I'm very fortunate in that I've always thought as a leader, it's far too much energy to dial up a different Nicola when I go to work to the Nicola that I wake up with. It's just too much work in my view. So I don't have to pretend to be somebody different when I'm at work. And I think that's enormously helpful. But I think what helped massively over that period, and particularly with our own employees, is that the investment that you've made in building trust, in not over-promising and under-delivering, and of course we're going to get it wrong as leaders, and I'm sure I've made many mistakes. I know I have, but it's incredible that when you do hit a crisis, the care that your employees have for the organization. It's not about me, the leader, but it is about our people. It is about the organizational ethos. It is about a culture. It's about a way of doing things. That's when it gets tested. It's easy during the good times. to celebrate the values that we have. It's when the tough times come. And so I would argue that one of the best investments that leaders can make in navigating crises is to try and build strong, resilient organizations in the good times. Now, we're not having those right now, but they will come. And that's the time to really be thinking about how you prepare for crisis.
Excellent. Okay, so I mean, from the comments that we have from our participants, Francis, there's definitely a theme that comes out, and the one question alludes to that is, what happens with these people who don't deal with a crisis properly, these multinationals that exploit, or businesses. So what's the upside for me to follow the rules or the principles? Because if I don't, what's the repercussion? Maybe a bit of a fall in the share price, but life still goes on.
Yeah. So very good question. And it was interesting to kind of look back on state capture and the claims and the myriad of companies involved. And I think that so many South Africans got lost in the details that they couldn't even keep up with who had done what wrong. So many people were implicated. And in a way, that's kind of a macabre protection for each company, because nobody can really rally against them because there's just so much wrongdoing across the board and so much suspicion. So maybe, yes, in a world of multiple crises, you can hide a bit, you can get away with a bit. But I think, and even Ford, I mean, look at the engine problem. There was an interesting article afterwards saying sales had hardly changed because of that. So we don't have that consumer activism in South Africa as well, where people say, I won't buy that car, or I will stop eating enterprise bacon for the rest of my life. We don't have a lot of that. But then there are other examples, and maybe there's a tipping point, or maybe it depends on the circumstances, but sometimes you can be caught in a crisis and the consequences can be dire. So look at KPMG. I think they lost a third of their business. They lost 20 listed clients in the months after what happened. And that was a big crisis with big consequences. We look at Tiger Brands, and yes, maybe people are still buying their meat products. Maybe they're still denying what happened. But their share price has been hit very hard. By last December, down 50% from the day before the crisis. And yes, some of that is market conditions. Crisis researchers try and use the share price as a sort of litmus test of reputation. It doesn't always work like that. It depends on the market as well. But that is not insignificant. And there have been concerns among investors about Tiger Brands' leadership. The CEO has now retired. But they've been open about those concerns about leadership, and a crisis exposes your leadership. And my final comment is something that we look at, that reputation is a resource that can be drawn down. So some of the researchers look at it as a bank account. And if you keep on drawing on it, if you keep on having a crisis after a crisis, and you handle it badly, maybe you'll get through those initial ones. But eventually there will come a point where there's enough ill will towards you that the next crisis, even a small one, can be the one that really breaks you. So you've got to think of that long-term view as well, where your reputation can be damaged by previous crises. Even as you're in a new crisis, people can say, yeah, you are guilty because you've always behaved like that in the past as well.
So I see one of the participants of this interview tonight is Bev, and she's asking the opposite question. Like, are there any examples of CEOs that actually get these principles right naturally?
So let me come in there and say, first of all, I think thinking about crisis management and getting it right or getting it wrong is not binary. As human beings, we get it more right some days, we get it less right other days. And we speak, one of the companies we speak about in the book is actually Woolies, because we speak about how Woolies got it so wrong with the Frankies example. And one could argue the baby carrier example that happened last year. But by the same token, they responded very quickly when it came to the Tiger Brands fiasco. And it shows this kind of, I don't want to say companies are human, but that it's a moving target. So I think when setting oneself up for failure, if you say this is a leader who always gets it right. Francis brought to the book the example of Sean Summers and how he, when he was CEO of Pick and Pay, handled the food poisoning crises. I think what we can do is we can look at leaders and how they handle a particular crisis, and we can evaluate them on that. What we can't do is, because we're all human beings, is say there's one organization that always gets it right or always gets it wrong. I think we've got some organizations that are known for reputation, known for safety, known for looking after their clients, and they're going to get it wrong. I mean, if I think about, for me, for example, somebody like Nando's is an organization that I think has a very, very strong ethos around the way it does business and trying to be honest and trying to be open. That doesn't mean that Nando's is not going to have crises that they battle. It doesn't mean they're not going to have crises they face. But fundamentally, for me, the more value-driven, the more principled, the more ethical the organizations are, the more likely they are going to be able to withstand those crises.
Yeah.
If I can just add, Jacques,
yes.
I just want to come in because she mentioned Pick and Pay, and what an extraordinary example. So by the way, initially we only found things wrong. It was hard to find those good examples. And I remembered this old example where, so you've got a situation where food in your stores could be poisoned by this poisoner who's out and about. You don't know if what you're buying is safe or not. But the CEO in that situation, and he was handling the press well, he was responsive, he was giving updates every day, he was talking to customers every single day through sort of prime time broadcasting. In the end, customers went to Pick and Pay to show their support. So they actually went and bought goods that were potentially unsafe. They still went to those stores. And that is what you want in a crisis. That is just an incredible situation. And we do point out that a crisis is actually an opportunity. So it exposes bad leadership, but it exposes good leadership as well. It's an opportunity to show who you are as a leader, to show who you are as a company, and engender more loyalty than you've ever had. And there we have a prime example, which was just fascinating to me.
Excellent. And I guess, I mean, on the one hand, I'm thinking, there's going to be cases where you've got CEOs who's just devious, where the crisis is because of something illegal or something that they've done, explicitly wrong. And then
Steinhoff, Jacques. If you said to us, why did we not write about Steinhoff? And we're not suggesting that there aren't some very committed people who are trying to get Steinhoff right. But this book is not about how do you deal with the Marcus Jooste. It's about how do you deal with somebody who fundamentally has good intent, but sometimes finds themselves thinking, what do I do now? And wants to run and hide, or how do I dial up the skills? Okay.
That makes sense, because one of the questions here that I see, so there's no one size fits all in crisis. And what I'm thinking is that, You've laid out the 10 principles or the 10 rules, but as you've said, some of them you're going to stuff up. You're gonna booby trap on one or two of them. But you've got an opportunity to bring up, and I mean, I will just go to be human, and be as human as you can to say, guys, we should have shared more, we didn't, but this is what was at stake. And this is what we're going to do to fix it, because when I work with clients, I always tell clients, if you look at the ESCOM and the load shedding that we had, and I mean, load shedding now seems like something in the far distance and very much on the periphery of any crisis. But in the days of load shedding, when ESCOM didn't tell you anything, people got upset. When load shedding just happened unexpectedly. But when ESCOM shared with you and say, on Friday at 10 o'clock, you're going to have load shedding, and they kept to their schedules, people are okay, because then people can plan, and you sort of take that fight or flight scenario out. And I guess that's the job of the leaders. That's what these principles that you've shared with us outline is for leaders to give them opportunity to take away that fight or flight scenario and give people the assurance that at least something positive, and that their intentions, because that's what we're speaking about, Nicola. We're talking about the intentions, is really to share the intention. And sometimes you share it in an incorrect manner. It's not like what you say, it's how you say it. That sometimes doesn't come out right, but it's about your intent in solving the issue, which I guess is what the big lesson is here for leaders and people that are concerned about their brand.
Yeah, Jacques, I would absolutely agree. And there's this point here that says there's no one size fits all. There's no standard crisis. Can't package a crisis. You can identify different kinds of crises. There are product harm crises. There are crises where the organization is fundamentally at fault versus the organization is actually affected by something that was actually caused by someone else. So it's quite hard to distill these key principles. And Francis and I actually speak about some people who I think until fairly recently have looked somewhat bulletproof by breaking all the rules. And Donald Trump is a key case in point. But if we start looking at what's playing out over the US now, maybe some might answer that, the cows are coming home. I think there's only so long that the public will tolerate being fed inconsistent stories, being given an opportunity or engaging when it suits you, causing harm, failing to acknowledging, trying to take, and Francis will be better here on the terminology than me, but sort of blustering or trying to take tax on different things. Those things are only going to work for so long. And then at some point we see through them.
Absolutely. Now we're approaching the close of our conversation, but I want to wrap it up with COVID and current stories. And Francis and I had a conversation earlier today about a story that was aired on Carte Blanche on Sunday, which was relating to the COVID crisis, and where insurance companies are involved in a big way, where their policies, people are starting to claim for their businesses against those policies, and how some of these insurance companies are just dealing with it, definitely not in line with the principles. And one would almost want to say, like, what's the advice for people out there in terms of dealing with this crisis? With business interruptions, with people losing their livelihood, and looking at from an insurance point of view.
So Jacques, I can take that, but I didn't actually see that insert on Carte Blanche. But what comes to mind is that ultimately everything gets exposed. Well, it usually does. And this is why these general principles sort of apply. So one of them is stop the harm. And that will relate to companies. We're already seeing claims that companies had a COVID case and they kept it quiet, or they didn't send their workers home. They didn't tell workers that they may have come into contact with another colleague who may have had COVID. They tried not to close down their shop. And those claims are already coming out. So the principle is stop the harm. And I don't know exactly what the insurance companies are accused of doing, but your ethics are ultimately revealed. And we even talk of that old ethical test, which is the New York Times test. So don't do anything right now. If you're sitting in a boardroom, or you're sitting in your living room on a Zoom call and you're making a decision, think about how you'll feel if that decision is exposed tomorrow in the New York Times or all over News 24. How will you feel? And if you're going to be embarrassed by the decisions you're taking or by things that you're doing, don't do them. So there are those ethical tests along the way. That's also make decisions you can defend. We talk about how easy it is to go in front of the press, even if people don't agree with the decisions you've made. If you believe in them, you'll be able to defend them. And that makes the whole process of being accountable to the public very, very easy. So I don't know if that answers the question, but a lot of it is about ethics and about the decisions that you're making in secret, how they can derail you if they are exposed. So try and think about these beforehand.
Excellent. Well, that's extremely good advice for leaders in this time. And Nicola, from your side, what would your advice be to leaders who are finding themselves in some of these ethical issues with regards to COVID, whether it is about an insurance payout or whether it is about disclosing information? What would your big thing be that you would want leaders to focus on?
So Jacques, I'm going to go one step back because something struck me as Francis was speaking, and how does one handle COVID? And one of the most poignant sort of conversations or interviews or releases that I've been exposed to was the interview with Grant Patterson around EdCon and how EdCon was being affected by COVID-19 and the very difficult decision that he had to make. And if one were to say to me, you know, who are some of the leaders you admire? I would certainly say I admire Grant Patterson. I think he was incredibly emotional. He was incredibly human. He came with really bad news. And certainly I didn't follow the media coverage altogether on it, but I didn't see anybody point a finger at Grant Patterson or EdCon from the way that was handled. So my advice around COVID-19 is, I think one of the hardest things that we are going to be facing is for companies to be honest, but to try and see opportunity. There are going to be, and there have already been, some very tough decisions. We're seeing retrenchments, we're seeing letting various stakeholders across the board down. And my advice to leaders would be not to be in denial around that. At the same time, the job of a leader is to bring hope. And as leaders, if we are not looking for how we will navigate through this crisis, because it will end, then we're not worthy of the title of leaders. So this balance between, on one hand, honesty, and on the other hand, the energy and an ability to try and find the opportunities in a very difficult time, I think is what is going to characterize the leaders who can navigate through COVID with integrity and keep their reputations intact.
Excellent. Thank you for those wise words, Nicola. And Francis, thank you for joining me here on the Business Book Club and sharing your insights and obviously your time with me and the audience. I truly enjoyed and loved our conversation. But if people want to get hold of your book, is it available on Amazon?
So Jacques, it is. It's available on Amazon and Kobo. And I did hear just from the publishers, it should be in stores this week or next week. So it will be possible to get your hands on a physical copy. Exclusive books, all the major outlets will have a copy within days. We hope. And that's what the publishers are saying.
Excellent. Are we looking at exclusive books, Estral books, or are we just saying the whole range?
Definitely exclusive.
Yeah.
And Francis and I would have loved to have done book signings over a glass of wine, but given social distancing, we're very sorry, Craig. We're not going to be able to autograph your books right now. Maybe when COVID is post, hopefully you'll still have it on your bookshelves in whenever it's going to be 6 months or 9 months. But please feel free to reach out. You're welcome to contact either of us through Jacques and ask us any questions. We really look forward to hearing your feedback. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your time and knowledge, because that's really what it's about here at the Business Book Club. And to everybody that's been part of this call, thank you very, very much. I trust that you have received the knowledge that you were looking for, that there's at least one thing that you're walking away with that you didn't know before you logged on. I'm wishing you all a blessed evening and a blessed time during this COVID epidemic. Keep positive and follow principle or rule number 6. I think that's the most important one, especially for me. It's just to be human, and to realize that we're all in the same boat. And as Nicola just famously said as well, this too shall pass, and we shall see a new dawn with new things. And like Francis mentioned, there's going to be absolutely new and amazing opportunities. So Francis, Nicola, thank you so much for your time. We loved having you, and we can't wait for your next book. You know, how to deal with life after COVID, and that interview will be in person, hopefully.
Thank you so much for having us, Jacques. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacques. Thank you, everybody, for dialing in.
Thanks.